They forced her to marry the gardener while her stepsister married a billionaire. But what they never expected was that the woman they tried to silence would rise and build an empire from the dirt they buried her in. This isn't just a story of survival. It's a story of quiet revenge, reclaimed dignity, and unexpected love. You won't believe how it ends. Where are you watching from? Tell us in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a story like this. They say a house can remember things. The creak in the floorboards where someone used to rock a child to sleep. The patch of wall warmed every morning by the sun, where once a quiet girl curled up with a book too big for her hands. I grew up in such a house. Massive, white-bricked, stately and cold. People used to say the Whitmore estate looked like something out of a postcard. But for me, it was more like a stage set where I was never given a script. I was Nora Whitmore, daughter of Henry Whitmore, real estate tycoon and widower. Or as everyone else in that house seemed to interpret it, the silent reminder of a woman they'd rather forget. My mother died when I was 9. One moment she was humming while slicing peaches in the kitchen, and the next there was a quiet funeral with too many flowers and a father who stopped making eye contact. 6 months later, Constance moved in. She didn't unpack like a guest. She arrived like a force of nature. Lace blouses, sharp pearls, perfume that stung. She brought with her a daughter named Aubrey, 2 years older than me, with gleaming blonde curls and a talent for taking up every room she walked into. Constance never called me stepdaughter. She rarely called me anything. The few times she addressed me, it was with a smile so polished it could slice bread. Nora, dear, please don't slouch. Posture says everything about a girl's breeding. Nora, try to smile in photos. You look so serious, it's unsettling. And always that phrase she wielded like a shield. We only want what's best for you. By the time I was 16, I knew better than to believe those words. What they really meant was, don't get in the way. Stay small, be grateful. And so I learned to fold myself into corners, to disappear behind locked bathroom doors with worn-out books. I ate dinners without speaking. I tiptoed around marble floors that felt more like ice than luxury. My father? He tried. In his own way. He'd pat my shoulder sometimes, distracted, mumble something about keeping the peace, but he was always too busy, too tired, too hollowed out by guilt. When I turned 18 and asked to apply to university, Constance folded her hands like I'd asked for the moon. It's not the right time, she said. Besides, dear, you don't even know what you want to do. What I didn't know then, what I would only find out later, was that the college fund my mother had set up for me had already been drained. Aubrey needed to study fashion in Milan. That apparently was more urgent. My father died 2 years later. A stroke, they said. Quick, painless. For him. Maybe. For me, it was like watching the last door close. At the will reading, I sat alone on the far side of the polished mahogany table. Constance dabbed fake tears with a silk handkerchief. Aubrey scrolled her phone under the table. When the lawyer announced that the entire estate, property, stocks, even the cars, had been left to Constance, I didn't flinch. I already knew. I just didn't know how thorough it would be. To my beloved daughter Nora, I entrust Constance with your care, believing she will treat you as her own. It would have been laughable if it hadn't stung so sharply. Treat me as her own? That woman wouldn't even lend me her car keys without arching an eyebrow. In the weeks that followed, the house changed in ways only I seemed to notice. My room became smaller, not in size, but in presence. Orders were given to staff without my knowledge. My belongings were moved. My meals were forgotten, then remembered late. I became the family ghost, not seen, not acknowledged, just expected to float along quietly. I handled grocery lists, checked expiration dates in the pantry, refilled the lavender diffusers in Aubrey's suite. The staff, cook, driver, housekeeper, watched me with quiet sympathy but said nothing. Because in that house, no one challenged Constance. Her control wasn't loud, it was surgical. She managed the calendar like a monarch, knew everyone's schedule down to the minute. Her voice was always calm, but behind it was a threat so refined it didn't need to be spoken aloud. Some days I'd linger by the back porch and watch the only person who didn't seem trapped, Marcus Ellis, the gardener. He was a man of quiet rituals, always out before the sun, trimming roses or mixing compost. Tall, strong hands, dark skin weathered by sun and soil. He never made eye contact unless spoken to, but something about his presence, it didn't shrink. That was rare around here. Once I saw him reading under the old oak tree during lunch break. Another time he repaired a leaking pipe near the greenhouse, even though no one had told him to. He was just there. Not trying to be more, but never less than himself. We didn't speak beyond nods. Maybe a soft mourning once in a while. But his silence wasn't the kind that pushed you away. It was the kind that didn't need to announce itself. I clung to routines to survive. The laundry folding, the list making, the silence. But every now and then, I'd catch glimpses of myself in the hallway mirror and flinch. Who was that girl with hollow cheeks and eyes that stopped asking questions? One day, while dusting the bookshelves in the drawing room, I overheard Constance on the phone. Her voice was syrupy sweet. Yes, she's still here. I'd been trying to sort out arrangements, something practical, discreet. My stomach turned. I knew that tone. I'd heard it before, when she was pawning off an unwanted gift or firing a staff member without using the word firing. That night, I stared at the ceiling in the dark, tracing the cracks in the plaster. I had dreams once. I used to picture myself traveling, maybe doing nonprofit work, maybe helping women like my mother, like me. I wanted to study economics, figure out how systems worked so I could change them. But somewhere along the way, those dreams had been packed into dusty boxes, like old china no one used. It wasn't the loss of luxury that hurt. It was the theft of purpose, of voice. So when Constance summoned me days later to the drawing room with her usual eerie calm, I felt a strange chill in my spine. Aubrey was lounging on the couch, a glass of wine in hand, grinning like she'd already rehearsed this scene. And beside her, Julian Grant, the senator's son. Every bit the polished air with charm slicker than oil. And I was still holding a dish rag. "We've been thinking," Constance began, her voice smooth as velvet and just as deceptive. "It's time we secured your future." I blinked. "My future?" She smiled. "Every woman deserves a household of her own." Then she said it. Just like that. "Marcus." Silence fell over the room like ash. I thought I misheard. Then Aubrey laughed. "The gardener, Nora. You're going to marry the gardener." I didn't speak. Couldn't. My throat had locked. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. Constance leaned in slightly. "It's a practical solution. You need a place. He needs stability. It serves you both." My mouth moved before my mind caught up. "You can't be serious." But she was. And I knew it. Deep down, I had known for months that something was coming. I just hadn't expected it to wear a wedding dress I never chose. As I walked back to my room, that dish rag still in my hand, I felt a silence wrap around me. Not the comforting kind, the kind that suffocates, the kind you don't scream against anymore, not because you've accepted it, but because you've run out of breath. That night, I sat by the window and watched Marcus's quarters. One light, then darkness, and all I could think was, I will survive this, somehow, because I always did. The morning the wedding was set, the sky outside was a pale, indifferent gray. I remember the way the clouds hovered low like they were trying to hide the sun, embarrassed to witness what was about to unfold. There was no excitement, no family bustling around with ribbons or cake orders. No one asked me what kind of flowers I liked. No one asked me anything at all. 3 days after the drawing room announcement, Constance handed me a folded piece of paper over breakfast. It wasn't even handed, really, just placed beside my plate like an afterthought. It had the address of the county registry office and a date, Thursday at 10 a.m. That was it. No explanation. No invitation. No warmth. The next morning, I opened my closet to find a cream-colored dress hanging on the handle. It was hideous. High-necked, stiff in the shoulders, too loose in the waist. It looked like something you'd wear to a court hearing or a funeral, both of which I suppose applied. The housekeeper helped zip me up in silence. She didn't meet my eyes, just tugged the zipper, smoothed the fabric, and walked away. They didn't even let me ride in the same car as Marcus. He was sent in the gardener's utility van, sitting in the back like cargo. I was in the passenger seat of Constance's borrowed sedan, driven by the housekeeper, who offered no conversation, only the soft click of the turning signal and the occasional glance in the rearview mirror. I stared out the window, watching the trees flicker past like witnesses refusing to intervene. When we arrived, the courthouse was nearly empty. No line, no voices, just fluorescent lighting and the scent of stale coffee from some far-off break room. The clerk behind the glass asked for our documents without even looking at us. He didn't blink when he read the names, Nora Whitmore and Marcus Ellis. Just pointed to a form and pushed it under the glass with a pen. I held the pen for a moment. My fingers trembled, not from nerves, but from the weight of everything unsaid. The air was thick and tight in my chest. I could still walk away, I thought. Right now, just drop the pen and run. But run where? I looked over at Marcus. He stood there, hands folded neatly in front of him, face unreadable. He didn't glance at me, didn't flinch, just waited, still as stone. I signed. Marcus took the pen and signed too, steady and silent. No dramatic pause, no deep breath, just ink on paper. And then it was done. We were married. There were no congratulations, no rings, no rice or champagne, just the slap of the clerk's stamp and the dry words, "You're good to go." Outside, the sky hadn't changed. Still gray, still hollow. I climbed into the car and we returned to the estate in silence. When we pulled in through the gates, no one was there to greet us. Aubrey wasn't home. Constance hadn't bothered to show up to the courthouse. Not even a servant stood waiting. I was now legally tied to someone I barely knew, in a transaction that felt more like eviction than matrimony. The quarters they gave me were behind the greenhouse near the service lane. A small building, divided in half, Marcus on one side, me on the other. 2 rooms, 2 doors. No shared kitchen, no shared anything. Just a cot, a chair, a tin sink, and a tiny window facing a patch of red dirt. I placed my bag down and sat on the edge of the cot. The silence was deafening. I could hear the faint sound of leaves rustling and the occasional clink of garden tools from Marcus's side. No footsteps, no voices, no "how do you feel?" No "are you all right?" That night I couldn't sleep. I kept staring at the ceiling, wondering what it was supposed to mean now, being someone's wife when no love had been offered, when no vows were exchanged and no future promised. I had been handed off like leftover furniture, stored in a corner of the estate no one cared to visit. I wondered if Marcus felt anything at all, if he resented this too, if he was just as trapped as I was. But he gave no sign. The next morning, I passed him on the gravel path, already dressed for work, gloves tucked in his belt. He nodded. "Morning," he said, voice low. I nodded back. That was all. A few days in, I left a cup of tea outside his door, not as a gesture of affection, just humanity. It came back later, empty but clean. I left another the next morning, again returned, empty, clean. We became ghosts passing each other. Sometimes I'd hear him talking softly to the plants or catch a glimpse of him scribbling in a worn notebook by the broken fountain. He worked with a rhythm I envied. Steady. Purposeful. My days, on the other hand, were shapeless. Aubrey's laughter still echoed from the main house. Garden parties, brunches, photo shoots. Her wedding to Julian was being planned with military precision. I wasn't invited to any of it. I watched from a distance as white tents went up and catering vans arrived. She'd pirouette through the garden like a queen, not once acknowledging that I existed just yards away. Then, one afternoon, a servant delivered another message. "Madam wants to see you." Back in the same drawing room, Constance didn't bother standing. She was scrolling on her tablet, sipping something iced. "You and Marcus will need to complete the civil certification next week," she said, still looking at the screen. I frowned. "We already did." "That was the registration," she said flatly. "This is the certificate, the legal filing. You'll need to sign again. Just formalities." "Why now?" I asked. Constance looked up, cold steel behind her blue eyes. "Because Aubrey's engagement party is in 2 weeks, and I won't have loose ends wandering around the estate." Aubrey walked in at that moment, wrapped in silk and smugness. She yawned and dropped onto the couch. "Is she still grumbling about marrying the gardener?" she asked. I said nothing. I simply turned and walked out. Not because I'd accepted it, but because I didn't want them to see me cry. That night, in the privacy of my cot, I did cry. Not for the wedding, not even for the insult, but for everything that had been peeled away piece by piece, my schooling, my choices, my sense of self. I cried because I realized there was no one left to fight for me, no safety net, no advocate, just this room, this tin roof, and a man I didn't know, living 10 feet away. The second signing was worse than the first. A dull courthouse clerk, another round of signatures, no hand to hold, no kiss, no photograph. I wore the same dress, Marcus wore a plain shirt, He didn't speak. I didn't look up. Afterward, we returned to the estate, each retreating into our respective halves of the building. The next 2 weeks passed like fog. Aubrey's wedding came and went. Fireworks burst over the trees. Music thumped through the night like a pulse I no longer had. I watched it from my small window, the glow of luxury flickering like a distant lighthouse I would never reach. And yet that night, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I packed a plate of food, jollof rice, fried plantain, grilled chicken, and carried it down the gravel path to the gate where Marcus was on duty, opening it for the parade of luxury cars. "You haven't eaten," I said softly. He looked up, genuinely surprised. "Thanks," he replied. His voice, for once, sounded human. I placed the plate down. Our eyes met, and in that strange flicker of shared exile, something shifted. Not love, not affection, just a quiet understanding between two people who had been thrown away but were still standing. We didn't say much else, but it was the first time I felt like I wasn't entirely invisible. The first week after Aubrey's wedding, the house returned to its usual stillness, just louder somehow. The glitter had settled, the guests were gone, but the echoes of wealth and celebration still clung to the place like perfume. I went about my days quietly, as always, sweeping out my side of the quarters, tending to basic errands, avoiding the main house unless summoned. Marcus, for his part, remained as silent and precise as ever. He raked, clipped, watered, and repaired, his rhythm steady and unfazed. But something in the air had changed, and maybe it wasn't the air. Maybe it was me. Every morning I saw him already outside when I stepped into the pale light of dawn. Sometimes I'd pass him near the edge of the hedge wall where he'd be coiling the hose, sometimes by the compost bin or the greenhouse door that still creaked no matter how many times he fixed the hinges. I always nodded, he always nodded back, nothing more. But one morning, I noticed something I hadn't before. A small notebook tucked under his arm. Brown leather cover, the corners worn soft. It was the same notebook I had seen that night, weeks ago when he'd been sketching in the shadows of the broken fountain. Later that day, while returning from the market with a sack of lentils and some bruised apples, I passed the back garden where he often worked alone. There he was, standing beside the cracked stone bench, pencil in hand, staring at the abandoned patch of land near the toolshed. He looked like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. I stopped a few steps away, not entirely sure why. "You're always here," I said quietly. He turned, surprised I'd spoken. "There's work to do." I took a few hesitant steps forward, curious despite myself. "What do you write in that notebook?" He looked down at the worn cover in his hand and hesitated for a beat. "Plans, ideas." "For what?" "For the future," he said simply. "Business models, projects I'd like to start." That answer caught me off guard. "Like what?" He closed the notebook, but not protectively, thoughtfully. "Delivery routes for local farms, a logistics system for small-scale vendors, a dispatch network for rural areas with no transport access." I blinked. "That's specific." "It's been in my head for years." His eyes met mine briefly. "Since I dropped out of school." "You went to school?" I asked, startled. He nodded. "University of Agriculture. I was studying agribusiness. My mother died in my second year. I had 2 younger brothers to feed. School had to wait." I stood still, absorbing this version of him I had never imagined. The quiet man behind the wheelbarrow, who once had dreams mapped out in spreadsheets and diagrams. "And now you're here," I said softly. "Now I'm here," he repeated, not bitterly, just plainly. We both went quiet, but this silence wasn't empty. It was full. A silence where two people sit beside the weight of their own broken paths and quietly acknowledge each other's. That night I lay awake again, not from sadness, but from a slow-burning thought. I had shelved my own dreams years ago, studying economics, working in community development, helping women like my mother, like myself. I'd packed those ambitions away like a set of dishes no one ever used, gathering dust in a cupboard called maybe someday. Now, for the first time in years, I wondered if they were still waiting for me. The next morning, I made tea and left 2 cups on the step between our quarters. One for him, one for me. When I stepped outside to fetch my laundry, both cups were gone, clean, neatly placed where I left them. From then on, our interactions started to stretch. Not much, just fragments at first. Passing comments, a shared tool, a word or two about the weather. But the space between us began to soften. One afternoon, he left a book outside my door. Farming the Margins, Sustainable Systems in Unstable Regions. It was dog-eared, pages full of pencil notes. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. I opened it and read until midnight. In return, I placed one of my mother's old paperbacks on his step, a novel about resilience in war. I wasn't sure if he'd like it, but I figured he'd understand it. A few days later, I passed by the greenhouse and saw him inside, flipping through it during lunch. He didn't say anything, just nodded. That was enough. We never talked about the marriage. We didn't need to. The quiet between us said all there was. We didn't choose this, but we chose not to let it ruin us. Once, over a rare shared meal on the stone steps outside our quarters, I finally asked what I'd been holding back since the courthouse. "Why didn't you refuse?" He didn't look up from his cup. "Because I didn't have the strength to fight," he said, "and because sometimes survival means choosing the least painful cage." That hit me like a blow to the chest, not because it was cruel, because it was the exact thing I hadn't been able to say out loud for years. I nodded slowly, swallowing the lump in my throat. From that point on, our days moved differently. I began waking up with something closer to purpose. Marcus showed me how to test soil density, how to spot healthy roots, how to rotate crops even in a tiny patch of land. We cleared the dead space behind the tool shed, turning over years of compacted soil. He built a compost barrel from scrap. I started a planting journal. It wasn't joy yet, but it was movement. And maybe that was enough to begin. We repaired the old greenhouse windows with salvaged glass, rebuilt the irrigation lines using spare pipe pieces Marcus had kept stored. He showed me how to calculate water flow. I showed him how to create a tracking spreadsheet on an old laptop the housekeeper had discarded. Some evenings, we sat on opposite ends of the same wooden bench, scribbling into our notebooks, his with diagrams, mine with timelines and cost estimates. We didn't talk much, but we didn't have to. Our world, once confined to a pair of tin-roofed rooms, was expanding, not in size but in hope, in intention. He told me once about the village he grew up in, where every household grew something, even if it was just basil in a tin can, where the kids were taught the smell of rain and the way to test soil with bare hands. He spoke of his mother's yam fields, his first encounter with a laptop, his internship at a logistics firm before life turned sideways. "I used to think education was enough," he said one night, watching the moon rise over the hedgerows, "that if I just worked hard, it would all sort itself out. But life doesn't reward effort. It punishes weakness." I took a slow breath. I used to think if I was quiet, if I didn't cause trouble, I'd be spared. I wasn't. He looked at me then, not with pity, with recognition, the kind that doesn't need explanation. That week, we planted our first carrot seeds. It was nothing grand, just a row of shallow furrows and a shared watering can. But it felt like reclaiming something, a choice, a promise. No one from the main house came to see, not Constance, not Aubrey. We existed on the edge of their kingdom, unseen, untended, and underestimated, which perhaps was the greatest freedom of all. The day we found the abandoned borehole, Marcus stood with one boot propped on a rusted spade, sweat rolling down his temple, shirt clinging to his back. The ground behind the western fence was thick with weeds and long-forgotten things, wild mint tangled with brittle roots. A crooked sign lay flat, half buried in dust, reading "Photo Studio Greenhouse, Private Use." I knelt beside a collapsed trellis and peeled away the vines like old bandages. "There's still water here," Marcus said quietly, pointing toward a faint outline in the soil. "Used to be tapped from an underground reservoir. Constance probably had it capped when Aubrey turned this into her Instagram set." He said the name without malice, just a tired sort of clarity. I nodded, brushing dirt from my hands. "If we reactivate it," he added, "we could run water straight to the beds behind the tool shed." "Would they let us?" I asked, even though we both already knew the answer. He looked at me for a long moment, then smiled, just slightly. "If we ask, they'll say no. If we act, they might not notice." It was the first time I'd seen mischief on Marcus's face, and something inside me lit up like a match in a dark room. "Then we act," I said. We started that night. While the estate slumbered in its marble silence, we unspooled old piping, dug channels by moonlight, and patched valves using salvaged parts Marcus had hoarded over the years. "Just in case," he told me. The soil was dry and heavy, but we worked steadily, side by side, saying little, The quiet between us filled with shovel strikes and the occasional muttered curse when a pipe burst or a wrench slipped. By week's end, water trickled, then poured into the beds. It wasn't a miracle, but it felt close. That morning, Marcus placed a document in front of me across the kitchen table. A grant application, printed and worn, creased from being folded too many times. The header read, Sustainable Urban Farming Pilot Proposal, International Agricultural Foundation. I wrote this 2 years ago, he said, eyes down, but I never sent it. I flipped through the pages, diagrams, logistics, budget forecasts, environmental projections. It was impressive. Not just smart, visionary. Why not? I asked. He shrugged. Life happened. I didn't think anyone would care. I read each section slowly, my fingers pausing on the margins filled with pencil notes and small crossed-out sentences. This is more than a garden, Marcus. This is a blueprint. He looked up. You think it's worth updating? I think it's worth sending. We spent the next week rewriting it together. I restructured the language, added financial projections, reformatted the design. Marcus explained routing models, yield ratios, and cooperative distribution. We debated sentence phrasing like other couples might argue over curtains. Sometimes we laughed over a typo, a confused statistic, a spreadsheet that wouldn't align. Other times we worked in focused silence, the hum of insects outside our only soundtrack. One night, while reviewing the final draft, Marcus glanced at me and said, I've never collaborated with anyone like this. I raised an eyebrow. Efficiently? No. Honestly. It was the highest compliment he could have offered. I felt it in my chest like a steady drum. When we submitted the application, I didn't expect anything. I'd learned by now not to hinge hope on outcomes, but it arrived. A week later, I found Marcus sitting under the guava tree, phone in hand, staring at the screen like it had just changed color. I walked over, wiping my hands on my apron. What is it? He turned the phone toward me. On the screen was a simple email. Congratulations. Your proposal has been selected for the second round of review. Please prepare the following documents. I clapped a hand over my mouth. You did it. We did it, he said. That night, we sat on the stone steps of the garden, watching the sun set behind the hedge wall. The air smelled of basil and wet earth. I leaned my head back against the wooden post and exhaled. For the first time since my mother's death, I felt something ease inside me. A door long closed creaked open, and the smallest breeze of possibility slipped through. For the first time, I whispered, this place doesn't feel like a cage. Marcus nodded slowly. Because we've started digging under the walls. After that, everything shifted, subtly but undeniably. The way we worked together became more intentional, more exacting. We charted tasks on the back of used envelopes. We kept a ledger, noted costs. I began writing emails to vendors and local seed suppliers under an alias. Miss N. Ellis. The surname gave us cover. The initial gave me power. We knew the Whitmores wouldn't tolerate disruption, so we made sure to be invisible in plain sight. I whispered instructions to the cook about preserving leftover rice for compost mulch. Marcus disguised new seedlings under the guise of landscape testing. We harvested in the early mornings before the main house stirred, bundled greens in cloth, stored tools in the hollow of a broken cabinet. At night, I'd read articles on farming cooperatives and food justice by flashlight. I bookmarked a government grant I wasn't sure we'd ever qualify for. I began mapping out a training program for women, just as a thought experiment at first, but soon it began to look real. Even the staff noticed. The housekeeper started slipping us extra eggs. The driver once delivered a set of bamboo poles to the back fence without a word. A silent coalition of the overlooked was taking root. We were no longer just surviving. We were resisting, gently, but with purpose. And then one day, while measuring soil pH, I looked up and saw Constance on the upstairs balcony. She wasn't watching the horizon. She was watching us. Her expression was unreadable. Not anger, not suspicion. Something deeper. Fear. That same evening, an envelope slid under our shared door. Inspection of service quarters scheduled. All activity to be disclosed. It wasn't about the hose pipe she claimed was missing. It wasn't about footprints or missing fertilizer. It was about control. She knew something was happening, but she didn't know what. That made us dangerous. Marcus didn't flinch. He continued with the grant documents, reaching out to former professors and contacts, gathering transcripts and proof of credentials. I digitized receipts, scanned letters, built a case file on an ancient laptop with a cracked screen. We became machine-like in our preparation, precise, efficient. At night, when exhaustion weighed on our limbs, Marcus would still lay out the irrigation blueprints and pencil in adjustments. I'd curl beside a stack of grant writing guides and scribble margin notes until sleep stole me. Sometimes he'd find me like that, blanket me with a scarf, and let me rest. We didn't speak of what came after. Not yet. But we worked like it was already on its way. And when the first confirmation came, an official request for a virtual interview, we sat on our narrow bench, knees touching, and held our breath like children trying not to wake a dream. This wasn't just about carrots and compost anymore. This was the beginning of something alive. Something that might outgrow the cage we'd been thrown into. And for the first time, we didn't just feel seen. We felt undeniable. We didn't celebrate when the foundation approved our proposal for the second round. We didn't pop open a bottle of anything or dance under the guava tree. We didn't know how to celebrate yet. All we knew how to do was keep moving. So that's what we did. Marcus reviewed their request list, documentation, property rights, academic proof, and quietly set about collecting every piece. I built folders on that beat-up laptop, sorted scanned images into categories with names like legal backup and verification archive. The room we once used to dry seeds and keep spare nails turned into our command post. In the evenings, we sat shoulder to shoulder at the crooked plastic table, our notebooks strewn between cups of ginger tea and a lamp held together with tape. Constance didn't come down to confront us. She didn't have to. Her presence arrived in other ways. Sudden inspections. Missing deliveries. The cook stopped giving us leftover rice. The hose near the greenhouse vanished. One day, Marcus came back from the pump and told me the lock had been changed. No explanation. "She's starting to pull strings," he said, not angry, just focused. "That means we're getting close." I watched his fingers tap on the table, calculating. "We need land," I whispered, "something that isn't hers." We couldn't build a future on a foundation that belonged to someone else. Even if we poured our sweat into every inch of her estate, one signature from Constance could tear it all away. So we looked. On our lunch breaks, on late afternoons, we wandered the outskirts of town. Marcus took the lead, asking local farmers about abandoned plots, speaking with shopkeepers, checking bulletin boards and word-of-mouth channels. We couldn't afford anything clean or convenient. What we found was a piece of land behind a public school, half-sloped and tangled in wild grass, with a rusted fence and a small spring running through the back edge. Everyone else had dismissed it. Too messy. Too far. Too broken. We saw potential. We pooled what little savings we had. I sold an old pair of earrings I'd hidden in my coat lining years ago. Marcus called a friend, an old classmate from university who worked at a local bank branch. He co-signed a small loan, no questions asked. The moment the deed was in our hands, we didn't celebrate. We started digging. The first week on the new land was brutal. The soil was compacted, the rocks sharp, the sun unrelenting. We slept in sleeping bags on pallets under a tarp, listening to coyotes in the distance and the creak of the wind against the fencing. But it was ours. No one could evict us. No one could tell us to quiet down. Every blister, every scratch felt like proof that we had finally stepped outside the shadow of someone else's empire. Still, news travels fast in a house like the Whitmores. It was the housekeeper who broke the silence first. She left a sack of lentils outside our quarters one morning with a note that simply read, "Good luck." The next day, the driver showed up with a dented water jug he said we could borrow indefinitely. We didn't ask how they knew. We just accepted it quietly. But Constance? She knew too. She didn't knock. She didn't call. She summoned me. I was at the compost pile when the errand boy came panting down the garden path. "Madam says you're wanted in the drawing room." The last time I'd been inside that house was the day of Aubrey's wedding. Everything felt cleaner now, emptier, a little too quiet. Constance sat in her usual chair, posture perfect, lipstick unbothered. "So it's true," she said without looking up. "You've managed to fool some foreign foundation into funding your little backyard circus." I didn't flinch. I had nothing left to flinch with. "It's not a circus," I said, "and I didn't fool anyone." She folded her hands slowly. "You think this makes you powerful, independent? No, I said, steady. It makes me free. Her eyes narrowed. You still live under my roof. Not anymore. The next morning a typed notice slid under our door. 30 days to vacate. I read it twice, then handed it to Marcus. He didn't even blink. She's scared, he said. She should be, I replied. We didn't panic. We worked faster. We moved our essential tools, our seeds, our notebooks. Marcus set up a makeshift shelter in the far corner of the new land. I reached out to a local church and secured a donation of furniture. Chairs, a table, even an old metal shelf. His old friend delivered a second-hand generator. We began mapping out a layout for crop rotation, printed new soil plans, and labeled everything in bold, permanent ink. Within 10 days, we were gone. No farewells. No slammed doors. Just two people walking away from a house that had never wanted them and toward a land that finally did. Weeks later, a small article appeared in the local newspaper. It was just a blip. Grassroots Farming Initiative receives international grant. But the photo caught attention. Not posed. Just me and Marcus standing in a field, hands on hips, sun behind us, our shadows stretching wide. At the estate, the housekeeper slipped it into the morning stack. Constance ripped it in two before finishing her coffee. But across town, under the canopy of a neem tree, I unfolded that same paper and smiled. We weren't in the dark anymore. The following week, we hosted our first school visit. A group of teenage girls arrived, curious and giggling, led by their principal. We set up stations, composting, irrigation, planting basics. I showed them how to recognize healthy roots. Marcus taught them how to test moisture levels by touch. One girl, no older than 15, pulled me aside. My stepmother says girls like me shouldn't dream too big, she whispered. Says we'll just end up wives anyway. I crouched beside her, wiped the dirt from my palms, and looked her in the eye. Then dream louder. And just like that, I saw the flicker. The same one that had lit in me months ago, when a man with calloused hands told me he once had a plan. Back on our land, Marcus sketched out designs for a new greenhouse. One that would serve as both a research plot and a training center. I started writing a curriculum for women like that girl, ones who'd been told to sit still and stay quiet, no more. We planted our second round of crops with the Foundation's advance funds. We dug trenches by hand, fed the soil with compost from our own scraps, and installed a solar water pump with the help of local volunteers. The field wasn't just growing food, it was growing people. And for the first time, I stopped waking up with dread. I woke up ready. I woke up with purpose. It started with a single row of spinach, green and trembling in the early morning light. The kind of green that made you stop and breathe deeper, as if your lungs suddenly remembered what life should feel like. Marcus crouched beside it, brushing his fingertips along the edge of a leaf, like it was something sacred. I stood a few steps behind, holding the watering can, trying to hide the grin that kept climbing up my cheeks. The earth had finally answered us. Within a week, the tomatoes followed, small at first but bright and round, poking out between the vines like quiet affirmations. Then came the carrots and the sweet corn, and the herbs we'd only dared to hope would take. The ground, once hostile and dry, had softened under our persistence, and in return, it began to give. We harvested our first baskets under the shade of the guava tree. The sun was low, casting long gold shadows over the ridges we dug by hand. I remember the way Marcus looked at me when I handed him a basket filled with green peppers, his face unreadable, but his eyes full. He didn't say anything, and he didn't need to. That silence between us had become fluent. We brought the produce to the local market that weekend. No grand stall, no branding, just a folding table, some paper bags, and 2 handwritten signs. No chemicals, just care. At first, people passed us by, suspicious of 2 newcomers with dirt on their sleeves and no fancy labels. But the spinach sold out in under an hour. Then the carrots, then the herbs. The chef from a nearby restaurant came back twice for more basil. A grandmother offered to trade her homemade soap for cucumbers. We returned home with our baskets empty and our hearts impossibly full. That night, we sat by the fire pit Marcus had built from old bricks. He had a habit of fiddling with things, stacking stones, adjusting the edges of the tarp over the shed, smoothing out the creases in our field maps. I watched him stir the embers with a stick, the flames catching in his dark eyes. "We're doing it," I whispered. He nodded. "We are." We didn't need more words, The foundation sent their official letter of congratulations a week later. We had passed the final review. The grant, $200,000, would be released in 2 phases. Half up front, the rest after the first audit. It was real now. Not a dream scribbled in a notebook, not an idea muttered under breath. It was happening. We opened a business account, registered Green Roots Cooperative officially with the local authorities. We designed a logo. Marcus drew it one night after dinner, a green root curling beneath a clenched fist. I painted it by hand on a wooden sign and nailed it to the gate myself. We used part of the grant to build a proper processing unit. Just a modest structure, but it had a tin roof, proper ventilation, and shelves for sorting. Marcus installed a solar-powered pump for the irrigation system, and I bought a used delivery van through a contact at the church. It smelled like diesel and old onions, but it ran like a dream. Then came the letters. A local high school asked if they could bring students for a tour. We said yes. Then 2 more schools wrote. A women's cooperative from a nearby village reached out, asking for guidance on starting something similar. We said yes again. Marcus and I spent our evenings planning workshops. We turned our old planting logs into lesson plans. I drafted a curriculum for sustainable farming and social entrepreneurship. Marcus led soil testing demonstrations and irrigation layout sessions. We trained our first group of volunteers, 3 girls from the shelter and 2 young men from the village, all with stories that reminded me too much of my own. I watched them in the fields, sleeves rolled, hands muddy, eyes bright. They didn't flinch at the work. They bloomed under it. Word spread. The mayor's office called, asking for a meeting. The regional paper ran a piece titled, "From the Margins to the Market." They used that same photo of Marcus and me standing in the field, hands on hips, sun behind us. Only now, they printed it in color. One evening, Marcus returned from the post office with a letter in his hand. I was at the sorting table, counting seed packets. "It's from the university," he said, handing it to me. I stared at the envelope for a long time before I opened it. My hands shook. Reinstatement approved. I read the words 3 times before I believed them. They had accepted my petition, recognized my years away as professional development, offered me a part-time schedule to continue my studies in development economics. I looked up at Marcus. He was watching me quietly. "I didn't think they'd say yes," I whispered. "I did," he said simply. I enrolled the next day. I attended my first class in a second-hand blazer and borrowed shoes, sitting near the back, surrounded by students nearly a decade younger than me. But I didn't care. I took notes like my life depended on it. In many ways, it did. Back at the farm, everything kept growing. Our cooperative expanded. We trained 10 new women that spring. One had escaped an abusive marriage. Another had aged out of foster care. The third had been rescued from trafficking. None of them had ever touched a shovel. But they learned. Quickly, patiently, fiercely. I partnered with a local NGO to provide them with counseling and health checks. Marcus secured a grant for a second greenhouse, this one dedicated to high-yield experimentation. We built it with the help of the community, each beam lifted by hands that had once only known hardship. Marcus became the director of agricultural systems for the cooperative. His name started appearing in journals, quietly, without fanfare. But it was there. We were no longer just a farm. We were a movement. People came not just to buy food, but to ask questions, to listen, to learn. We taught them how to compost, how to rotate crops, how to build irrigation with nothing but old pipes and hope. We showed them what could grow when you refused to be erased. One afternoon, as I walked the perimeter of the property, clipboard in hand, I caught sight of Marcus near the compost bin. He was speaking to a group of teenage boys, explaining the solar panel circuit with calm precision. They nodded along, eyes wide, notebooks open. Later, I found one of them lingering near the gate. "Why doesn't he just hire city electricians?" the boy asked. I smiled. "Because if you learn how to do it here," I said, "you'll teach someone else. That's how we grow." That night, I stood by the window of our new home, a small wooden structure at the edge of the field, with a tin roof and the smell of eucalyptus drifting in through the cracks. The sun had just set, casting everything in soft amber. I looked out at the farm we'd built with our hands, the rows of crops, the painted sign, the laughter of women in the distance, still working beneath lanterns strung from the trees. I thought about who I used to be. Nora Whitmore, the girl in the big house with silent halls and hollow walls. The girl they forgot. The girl they tried to bury in silence and shame. And now I was the founder of something that mattered. Now I wasn't just surviving. I was growing. The day I saw Constance again, she was standing just outside the greenhouse, her heels sinking slightly into the soft earth, looking entirely out of place. Her hair was still immaculately pinned, though a little thinner now. Her scarf was designer, but her eyes, those cold, cutting eyes, were tired. Not exhausted, no, just cornered. I had been sorting seeds when Marcus came to find me. "She's here," he said simply. I didn't need to ask who. By the time I reached the entrance, she was already scanning the field. Her gaze paused briefly on the cooperative sign before settling on me. "I just want to talk," she said. I didn't answer. I stood in the sun, dirt on my hands, clipboard under one arm, waiting. She cleared her throat. "The house, things aren't as stable as they used to be. I know we've had our differences." "We're not having differences," I said, calm. "We're just not the same species anymore." She flinched slightly, but pressed on. "You're still family," she said, voice tightening like a violin string pulled too far. I tilted my head. "I was never treated like family. You called me a burden and married me off like a bad expense." "That was before," she whispered, and for a second her voice cracked. "I didn't know." "No," I said, wiping the dirt from my palms onto my apron. "You didn't care. That's different." She looked away, her lips pinched, hands clasped like she was holding on to the last thread of pride. For a moment, I almost pitied her. But then I remembered the cold white dress, the silence of the courtroom, the weeks of invisible labor, of being called practical. "I'm not here to beg," she said, though her voice suggested otherwise. "It's Aubrey. She's lost everything." I stared at her, the air between us heavy and unmoving. "She's broken," she added, "and it's my fault." I paused, then placed the clipboard on the crate beside me. "I can't undo what's been done," I said softly. "I can't fix what you built on lies, but I can offer her a place in the next training group, if she's willing to learn." Constance blinked, stunned. Her mouth opened as if to speak, but nothing came out. Instead, she nodded once, sharp, almost grateful, and turned back toward her car. As she walked away, Marcus appeared beside me holding 2 mugs of tea. I took one and sat down beside him on the bench outside the shed. "You didn't have to be kind," he said after a moment. I took a sip and stared out at the rows of lettuce glinting in the afternoon sun. "I wasn't kind," I replied. "I was fair." That evening, a letter arrived from a local girls' school asking for a visit. They'd heard about our workshops and wanted to bring a group of students to see what farming looked like when it was led by women. I said yes, of course. We prepared stations, composting, irrigation, seed selection. I spent the night before writing notes on empowerment and ownership, words I never thought I'd one day say aloud to a room full of girls. They came wide-eyed and curious, notebooks in hand, shoes still clean. I showed them how to read the tilt of leaves like emotions. Marcus explained how to track soil memory through scent. At the end, one girl stayed behind, 15, maybe. Big eyes, nervous hands. "My stepmother says girls like me should just get married and stop thinking so much," she whispered. I knelt beside her. "Then think louder," I said. Her eyes lit up, and I knew something had shifted, not just in her, but in the world she might help shape. The visits became more frequent. 2 more schools. Then a group of government officials, a local women's cooperative from the neighboring district, asked for mentorship. I began drafting a guidebook. Nothing fancy, just handwritten notes and diagrams and reminders like, never let anyone call your ambition a phase. The second half of the grant came through, and with it we expanded again. A new fence, a small processing house, a cold storage room. Marcus painted the shed himself. The community donated their time, materials, even meals for the workers. The farm wasn't just ours anymore. It belonged to everyone who had once been pushed aside. And then one morning, it happened. Savannah showed up. No fanfare, no drama. Just her, standing at the edge of the path in a plain blue blouse and jeans. No makeup, no entourage. In her hands a small container. "I heard," she said quietly, "about the center, the grant, everything." I waited. She held out the container. "It's pawpaw, from my garden. I thought maybe I could contribute." I took the container and nodded once, then stepped aside. She followed me in. We didn't speak much. She watched the others, asked a few soft questions, then rolled up her sleeves and helped transplant seedlings. She stayed for the day, then returned the next. She never asked for special treatment, never referenced the past. One afternoon, after watering the northern plots, she sat beside me under the neem tree. We didn't talk about the house, or the wedding, or the day they handed me off like a package with no return address. We talked about soil acidity, about the best time to plant cassava, and for the first time I saw a version of her that wasn't born in Constance's image. I saw someone trying. The weeks passed quietly. Our cooperative grew. Our team expanded to 20 women, most of them from backgrounds like mine. Overlooked, unheard, underestimated. We taught, trained, tilled, and laughed. At night, the fields glowed under strings of solar lights, and sometimes you could hear humming, old lullabies or soft gospel tunes rising from the rows. The night before our 1-year anniversary, Marcus found me on the porch, a bundle of dried herbs in my lap. "You remember the first night in the quarters?" he asked. "I thought I'd made the biggest mistake of my life," I said. "I thought I'd never get out." He smiled faintly, sitting beside me. "We built this with our hands," he said. "No one can take it from us now." And he was right. In the distance I saw Savannah helping one of the new girls arrange seedlings into trays. The girl had lost her parents in a fire, barely spoke above a whisper when she arrived. Now she laughed out loud, hands deep in soil. The past hadn't disappeared, but it no longer had power over us. What they meant for exile had become our beginning. And we were just getting started. The morning sun rolled over the fields like a soft drumbeat, quiet and deliberate, spreading golden light across the rows of kale and cassava. Dew clung to the leaves like silver punctuation, a quiet reward for a long night's labor. I stood near the edge of the farm, a clipboard in one hand, pencil tucked behind my ear, watching the women begin their routines, watering, pruning, guiding new volunteers. The field was alive in a way that didn't need words. The rhythm of work had become a kind of hymn. A year ago, I'd been standing in the same position with nothing but an old rake, an aching back, and the echo of Constance's voice still clinging to the walls of my memory. Now I stood in front of a living blueprint. Something we had built with our own hands, no permission asked, no inheritance needed. Behind me, the new greenhouse stood proud, its panels catching the light. It had become more than a structure. It was a place of research, of experimentation. Lately, we'd been working with the university on seedling development, high yield, climate resistant, low input. I never thought I'd say those words aloud, let alone understand them, let alone teach them. But that's what I did now. The administrative building, once a broken shed filled with rusted tools, now had a nameplate. Green Roots Initiative, Center for Land, Learning, and Livelihood. I'd traced every letter myself with a wood-burning pen. It wasn't just a name, it was proof. Inside, the walls were painted in soft earth tones. There were framed articles, a chalkboard filled with crop schedules and duty rotations, and a filing cabinet that held everything from workshop sign-in sheets to grant audit paperwork. The space smelled like coffee and paper and freshly tilled soil. That week, 3 new women had joined us from the local shelter. One had fled a violent home, another had just turned 18 and had nowhere else to go. The third, Esther, was so quiet I didn't hear her speak until her 3rd day. But they worked hard. They arrived early, stayed late, and by the end of their first week, they were correcting new recruits on watering techniques. I paid each of them a small stipend from the training fund and ensured they had access to a counselor who came every Thursday. I knew what healing looked like. It took time, silence, and soil. Marcus, too, had grown into his own. He no longer moved like a man in someone else's backyard. He walked the fields like he belonged to them. He oversaw our entire operations network now, irrigation systems, harvesting calendars, yield tracking, transport routes. He'd even been invited to consult with 2 other farms that had reached out after hearing about our project. One afternoon, after a community meeting, I found him in the shade of the eucalyptus trees talking with a group of teenage boys. They were asking about solar panels, trying to understand the circuits. One of them asked, "Why don't you just hire someone from the city?" Marcus smiled and replied, "Because if you learn how to do it here, you'll teach someone else." That's how we grow. That became our motto. That spring, we applied for a regional farming award. We didn't win, but we were shortlisted. A journalist visited and wrote a feature titled "The Field That Refused to Die." I cried when I saw it printed. One morning, as I sat in the admin office reviewing budgets, an email arrived from the university. Subject: scholarship update and invitation to speak. They had not only reinstated my part-time program, they wanted me to deliver a guest lecture on sustainable rural economies. I stared at the screen for a long moment, then turned the laptop toward Marcus. His face broke into a smile. "You're going to knock them flat?" he said. I did. I wore a blouse from the second-hand shop and spoke in front of 200 students, most of them younger than I'd ever felt. I told them about power, not the kind in bank accounts or corner offices, but the kind found in refusing to disappear. Afterward, a student approached me and said, "You made me want to go back home and start something." And just like that, the field kept spreading. We helped 3 other cooperatives launch that year, one in a floodplain, one in the dry hills, one in the outer rim of a city slum. Each of them followed our model: low-cost inputs, woman-led training, dignity-first policies. We shared our planting schedules, our budgeting templates, our everything. Back in the city, I heard that Constance had sold the house. The mansion on Rosewood Lane, the one with arched windows and marble staircases, had gone up for auction. The buyers didn't care about the legacy. They were going to demolish it and build condos. I didn't feel anything. Not anger. Not triumph. Just quiet detachment. Savannah, meanwhile, had become a regular face at the cooperative. She showed up early, dug her own holes, asked real questions. She'd started a backyard garden of her own and sometimes brought pawpaw or hibiscus to share. We never talked about the past. She never apologized. I never asked her to. But one day, after finishing her tasks, she said quietly, "I used to think you were weak." I didn't turn to her. Just kept tying up tomato vines. She continued, "But it turns out I had no idea what strength looked like." I let the silence hold her words for a moment, then said, "Neither did I, back then." In early fall, we hosted our anniversary celebration. No reporters, no speeches, just the people who had built this with their hands. Trainees, mentors, volunteers, neighbors. We cooked together. We laid out long wooden benches under the neem trees. There was jollof rice, roasted plantains, pepper soup, and laughter that could loosen even the tightest chest. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the singing began, soft at first, then louder. A kind of song passed down in rhythms rather than notes, carried in the backs of throats and the soles of tired feet. Marcus sat beside me, watching the field as though it were a child he'd raised. "Do you ever think about that first day?" he asked. "When they told you to marry me?" I looked at him, not smiling, but deeply settled. "Every day," he chuckled. "What would you have done if you could go back?" I thought for a second. I would have said no louder and walked away on my own terms. He nodded, his hand brushing mine. "And now?" I looked around at the tables, the people, the rows of crops glowing faintly under lantern light. Now I know why I stayed. A few months later, Marcus surprised me with a small box. No wrapping, no flowers. Inside was a simple silver ring etched with a vine pattern. "I know we were forced into something neither of us wanted," he said, "but I also know we've built something neither of us expected. I'm not asking out of obligation. I'm asking as your partner." I didn't cry. I just slid the ring onto my finger. It fit perfectly. We exchanged vows the next morning, standing near the greenhouse in front of our staff. No white dress, no choir, just hands held, paper signed, and work resumed after the hugs were over. That night, as we stood on the porch of our small home, built beside the training center, beneath the moon, we looked out at what we had grown. "You know what amazes me?" I whispered. Marcus turned toward me. "What?" "We started in someone else's backlot, and now we're not just free, we're whole." He pulled me close and we stood there in silence, listening to the sound of women singing in the fields. The land didn't remember who once tried to bury us. It only remembered what we planted. And we were still planting. Thank you so much for staying with me through the end of this story. If you're still here, it means you felt something, and that matters. Nora and Marcus's journey wasn't just about farming or survival. It was about reclaiming dignity, about rising, even when the world tries to bury you in silence and shame. Their story teaches us that freedom doesn't always arrive with fireworks. It often grows slowly, quietly, one seed at a time. Sometimes we don't choose the circumstances we're placed in, but we do choose what we build from them. What about you? Where are you watching from? I'd love to know what part of the world you're in and how this story resonated with you. If you found value in this journey, if it moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of your own strength, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Your support means everything. And when the next story arrives, I want you to be right here with us. Until then, keep growing, keep dreaming, and never let anyone write the ending for you.